There's a stretch of farmland in the south of England where the wheat sometimes lies down overnight in shapes too clean to be accidental and too large to be quick. Farmers have walked out at first light for decades to find rings and spirals pressed into their fields, the stalks bent but not broken, the grass around them undisturbed, no footprints leading in and none leading out. For most of that time, the story people told themselves was simple. Somebody did this with boards and rope under cover of darkness for the thrill of being talked about. It was a prank, a rural in-joke that got bigger than anyone expected. That explanation worked for a while. It stopped working the day someone finally sat down and actually counted. Late last year, a small independent research collective calling itself the Pattern Continuity Project decided to do something nobody had seriously attempted before. Instead of arguing about crop circles, they decided to measure them. Not measure them the way a farmer measures a ruined field for insurance purposes, but measure them the way a linguist measures a language. For structure, for repetition, for the fingerprints that separate a scrawl from a sentence. They pulled together the largest archive of crop formation photographs ever assembled in one place. More than 11,000 images, spanning 50 years, sourced from British newspaper archives, amateur photography collectives, aerial survey companies, and private collections that had never been digitized before. Then they built a machine learning model, trained it on nothing but raw geometry, and asked it a single question. Is there a pattern here, or have we been staring at noise for half a century? The team was careful about how they set this up, because they knew that if they wanted anyone to take the answer seriously, they had to make sure the machine could not be accused of wanting a particular answer. It was not told that crop circles were considered mysterious. It was not fed a single word of folklore, no theories about aliens, no newspaper headlines, no context at all beyond the raw shapes and the dates and locations attached to them. As far as the model was concerned, it was looking at 50 years of geometric marks in agricultural fields, and nothing more. That kind of blank slate approach matters, because an algorithm with no beliefs cannot be accused of finding a mystery, because it wanted one to exist. It only reports what the numbers show. What the numbers showed was not what anyone on the team expected. They had gone and braced for one of two outcomes. Either the shapes would turn out to be essentially random, a scattershot of independent hoaxes with no through line, exactly what 50 years of uncoordinated pranksters would produce, or there would be a handful of recycled motifs, the same few tricks repeated with minor variation, the visual equivalent of 100 different people drawing the same smiley face. Either result would have been mundane enough to end the conversation. Instead, the model returned something else, a measurable, consistent climb in complexity, stretched across 5 decades, moving in one direction without exception, not scattered, not random, a curve. To understand how strange that curve is, it helps to go back to where the whole phenomenon began. In the chalky, ancient farmland of Wiltshire in the late 1970s, a landscape already thick with human history. This is the same ground that holds Stonehenge, the same region dotted with burial mounds and hill figures cut into the chalk centuries before anyone thought to ask who made them. So when farmers in that same stretch of countryside started finding circles pressed into their wheat, there was an odd sense that the land was simply doing what it had always done, being marked by something, for reasons nobody could fully explain. Those first formations were almost laughably plain. A single ring, nothing more. No attached shapes, no internal structure, just a smooth swirl of flattened stalks lying in one uniform direction, as if pressed down by something broad and gentle rather than violent. People shrugged it off easily. A downdraft, some said, a whirlwind that spun itself out over a field. Others blamed deer or badgers circling in some kind of mating ritual, or simply the way wet crop settles after a storm. Nobody imagined that 50 years later anyone would still be talking about it, let alone feeding it into a machine. But when the research team's model looked back at that first decade with no memory of how unremarkable it had seemed at the time, it flagged those early circles as something specific. Not noise, not accident, but a baseline, a starting point. In terms of raw information content, a single circle carries almost nothing. One center point, one radius, one continuous curve. If you were building a system to communicate, or some process were slowly teaching itself to produce complexity, this is exactly where you'd expect it to start, with the simplest mark that still counts as a mark at all, and then the shape stops staying simple. That's the detail that turns this from a curiosity into a puzzle. If the circles had remained solitary rings for 5 decades, there would be nothing to analyze. Wind can make a circle, a tethered animal walking a loop can make a circle, teenagers with plank and a length of rope can absolutely make a circle. What none of those explanations account for is a design that gets more sophisticated in a consistent direction year after year, as if it were following a curriculum nobody wrote down. Through the early 1980s, the single ring began to gather company. Fields that once held one lonely circle now held several, and not scattered at random, arranged. A large central ring would appear with smaller circles spaced evenly around it, like a diagram waiting to be labeled. The formations grew larger and, more importantly, more confident. To a farmer standing at the edge of a field, one circle could be explained away as weather. For circles in deliberate, evenly spaced row down the middle of a wheat field could not be so easily dismissed. The mind starts reaching for a different word. Someone planned this. Someone measured this. Someone walked this field in the dark and left no trace of how they did it. The model picked up on this shift as well, and it didn't dismiss it the way the early witnesses eventually learned to. It quantified it. The complexity scores began climbing off the floor. Circles connected by narrow corridors of flattened crop. The first hints of true symmetry. A left side mirroring a right. A top answering a bottom. These weren't isolated marks anymore. They were short compound structures, the visual equivalent of a word built from 2 or 3 letters rather than a single stroke. By the middle of the 1980s, the geometry had hardened into something nobody could dismiss as coincidence. Smaller rings weren't just sitting near the larger ones anymore. They were physically joined to them, connected by clean corridors of pressed stalks, forming shapes that resemble keys or interlocking gears, or symbols pulled from an alphabet nobody had ever been taught. Concentric rings appeared with edges so precise that standing at the boundary, you could put one foot on upright wheat and the other on flattened crop with barely a hand's width of transition between them. No gradual bending, no ragged edge with a pattern lost confidence. A line, and on either side of it, 2 completely different rules. Photographers began chartering small aircraft because it had become obvious these designs were not built to be appreciated from the ground. Standing at the edge of a field, all a person saw was a confusing sprawl of bent stalks, an impression of disturbance without any obvious shape. Lift the same field 200 feet into the air, though, and the sprawl resolved into something balanced and centered, composed for a viewer looking straight down. That detail troubled the research team more than almost anything else in the early data. Whoever, or whatever, was producing these shapes was designing them for an aerial perspective, an eye hovering above the crop that no person standing in the field at night could have possessed. And running underneath all of this, the model kept returning to one quiet, consistent observation. The designs weren't repeating themselves. A hoaxer, even a skilled and dedicated one, tends to lean on what works, a signature trick, a favorite motif, a shortcut proven from experience. But the formations of the mid-1980s rarely echoed what had come before. Instead, they built on it. A ring structure that appeared one summer would return the following year with an added layer, a new axis of symmetry, a refinement that assumed the viewer already understood the earlier version. It read less like a person doing the same shape from memory, and more like a student turning in progressively harder work, each submission proving the previous lesson had been absorbed. By the end of the 1980s, the climbing line on a research team's graph had stopped looking like noise and started looking like a trend with a driver behind it. The kind of steady upward slope statisticians associate with a mechanism, not a coincidence. And then, right as the calendar rolled into the 1990s, something happened that the model was not prepared for. Up to that point, the story had been one of patient increments, a little more symmetry each year, one more ring, a steadier hand. It looked like a slow apprenticeship, but the data from the early 1990s didn't step up gradually. It jumped. The model, which had built a running expectation for what each new season's most complex formation should look like based on everything before it, encountered formations so far outside that expectation that its own anomaly detection flagged them before any human researcher had even opened the folder. The team gave this moment a plain, almost bureaucratic name: the complexity threshold. Everything before it clustered in a recognizable band. 3 or 4 elements, sometimes 5, careful but achievable, the kind of thing a determined team with rope and boards could plausibly produce across a long summer night if nobody looked too closely at the seams. The formations that began appearing in the early 1990s did not sit anywhere near that band. They sat far above it. 15, sometimes 20 distinct elements, nested shapes locked inside other shapes, each holding a precise angular relationship to the one before it. Symmetry maintained across the entire span of a field with no measurable drift and no sloppy corner, where the design quietly gave up. What unsettled the researchers wasn't only the size of that jump, it was its shape. A gradual escalation would have shown up as a curve, a handful of transitional years bridging the old complexity band to the new one. There was no bridge in the data. The transition was close to vertical. One season, the fields were producing short, simple statements. The next, they were producing interlocking paragraphs, as if the intermediate steps had simply never been necessary. And the timing carried a detail that made the whole thing harder to write off. If a single, unusually gifted hoaxer had finally cracked some new technique, that sophistication should have appeared in one place first and spread outward the way any human skill spreads, unevenly, with a point of origin, showing up in other countries months or years later as the method traveled. Instead, the team found a complexity threshold crossed in multiple countries within the same narrow window, fields separated by oceans, languages, and every practical barrier that should have slowed the movement of a shared idea. It was as if the shift happened everywhere at close to the same moment, rather than spreading outward from a single source. After that threshold, the climb didn't level off. It kept accelerating, and the rate of that acceleration kept increasing too. In plain terms, complexity wasn't just going up, it was going up faster, with each passing year, which raised the uncomfortable question one member of the research team scrawled in the margin of a printout and underlined twice. What happened in 1990? Because a hand does not simply wake up one summer and produce 20 flawless nested elements across an acre of standing wheat in a single night with no history of failed attempt behind it. Skills like that are built through trial and error, in view of somebody, somewhere, and the record held no trial and no error. No half-finished 12-element design abandoned partway through. No visible learning curve at all, as though the capability hadn't been developed gradually, but had simply arrived fully formed. The team checked for a mundane explanation, better tools, a widely circulated instruction manual, some new generation of enthusiast trading techniques. Nothing in the ordinary historical record lined up cleanly with a simultaneous, multi-continent leap of that scale. Whatever cause it left no trace in the world of headlines and patents and hobbyist newsletters. It only left a trace in the fields themselves, in stems bent rather than snapped at the growth nodes, a detail earlier physical investigations had already noted without explaining, in soil samples from a handful of formations that reportedly showed faint anomalies in mineral structure, the kind sometimes associated with brief, intense energy exposure, and now, layered on top of all of it, a mathematical signature the model could not ignore, formations whose proportions consistently echoed the golden ratio, structures that repeated at shrinking scales the way a fern frond or a coastline does. And, most striking of all when it first appeared on the team's dashboard, arrangements that, when read as a sequence of present and absent elements, resolve into strings that looked unmistakably binary. The simplest code there is, the kind you reach for when you want to be understood by something that shares no language with you at all. The model didn't know what any of the binary sequences said. If they said anything, it only knew, with a flat certainty that comes from arithmetic rather than imagination, that after 1990, the fields had stopped looking like decoration and started looking like a channel. And a channel, unlike an ornament, exists to carry something. So the researchers asked the next obvious question. Not how elaborate the shapes had become, but how much they could theoretically hold. Information has a kind of weight to it. A page holds more than a single letter. A book holds more than a page. The model assigned each formation a rough capacity score based on its symmetry, its element count, its layering, its use of nested and repeating structures. The earliest circle scored almost nothing. A single flattened ring in a 1978 field carries about as much information as one did on an otherwise blank page. Through the 1980s, that number crept upward the way a child's vocabulary grows, one word at a time. Then came the line the team had already learned to expect with a kind of dread. After 1990, the capacity didn't creep. It climbed, then climbed faster still through the 2000s as binary strings and interlocking geometry began stacking into single formations. Plotted across 50 years, the curve didn't draw a gentle slope. It bent upward and kept bending, the unmistakable signature of something not just growing, but multiplying. An exponential curve, the same shape you see when a technology matures or when a communication system crosses the threshold from scattered grunts into something with grammar. And because it was a curve, the model could do the one thing that turns a mystery into a warning. Extend it forward. The projection was specific and quiet, and it was the moment the room reportedly went still. If the rate of increase held steady, the most complex formations would, within roughly a decade, cross a line no crop formation in the historical record had ever reached, a point where a single design could theoretically hold as much structured information as a page of written language. Not a symbol, not a fragment. Something closer to a message, with a beginning, a middle, and whatever intention sits behind those. The model never claimed to know who or what might be behind that curve, and to their credit, the research team was careful not to pretend otherwise. What they had actually demonstrated was narrower and, in its own way, more unsettling. That across 50 years and 4 continents, the marks appearing in agricultural fields had grown steadily more mathematical and more information-dense, in a pattern too smooth and too geographically coordinated to be the sum of unconnected pranks, and too abrupt at its 1990 hinge point to look like ordinary human skill building. The pattern, whatever it was real, and it was still rising. What was for remains exactly where it has always been, out of reach, somewhere above the field in the dark. The team laid out their possibilities without ranking them, because ranking them wasn't something the data could support. The first is the least exotic, a hidden, extraordinarily disciplined human effort, running for half a century, seeding the fields with escalating geometry for reasons no one has ever confessed to, the bent stem nodes, the untouched soil around the formations, and the total absence of failed attempts, all somehow explained by a level of coordinated skill nobody has caught in the act. The second is stranger, some intelligence, source unidentified, using open farmland as a slow, patient page, writing in a hand that steadies a little more with each passing season, working toward a legibility it hasn't reached yet. And the third possibility is the one the researchers seem most reluctant to name out loud, that what they'd measured wasn't a message from anyone at all, but a process without a clean label yet, refining itself toward a purpose that won't be understood until the day it finally finishes. The crops still fall every July and August, in the weeks after the wheat has grown tall, and before the harvesters arrive, still concentrated in the same green corners of southern England, within sight of monuments raised by people who watched the same sky, and left their own marks on the same earth thousands of years earlier. And by every count the analysis could gather, the formations are still growing more complex, not less, more numerous, more intricate, more information-dense, in a decade when a 50-year-old prank should have long since run out of momentum and imagination. Maybe that's all it ever was, patience, rope, and quiet human skill, kept secret out of pride rather than concealment. The human mind is extraordinarily good at finding a face in static, in a sentence and noise, and it's entirely possible that the only intelligence present in these fields is the one standing at the edge of them, wanting there to be more than there is. A curve is not a sender. A pattern in the crop is, at its most basic, a pattern in something, and something is not the same as someone, but the curve is real and a model with no stake in the outcome, no hope and no capacity for embarrassment, laid 50 years of it end to end, and drew a line that is not yet leveled off. If that line holds, sometime in the next several years, the most complex formations on record may be capable of carrying something close to a written sentence, which leaves one honest question, and it isn't the models to answer. If a formation ever does appear that reads as unmistakably legible, in binary and geometry, in some code nobody has cracked yet, would you trust enough to try reading it? Or would you assume, all the way down, that someone very clever had simply built it to make you wonder?